Hi, good evening. My name is Camille Martinez, and I'm the Secretary of the Latino Student Organization, and it is my pleasure to be here today at the 2024 Hispanic Heritage Month lecture. This event is meant to be a continued conversation at Hope College to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. Tonight, we will hear a keynote lecture from Dr. Pablo Peschiera, who is an English professor here at Hope College and a 1993 Hope alum. Immediately after the lecture, we will have a Q&A discussion where you'll be able to ask questions via a Google form. To submit any questions, please scan the QR code on the screen, or we have note cards for you to write your questions, and we will submit them online. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land we stand on. Together, we acknowledge that we gather as Hope College on the traditional land of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwa peoples past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who've stewarded it throughout the generations. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoings. We acknowledge this long history of injustice and commit to educating ourselves and our community as we seek to honor legacy and the culture of Indigenous peoples. We are grateful to LSO and the Center for Diversity and Inclusion for their support in sponsoring this program. Again, thank you for coming to this lecture, and I hope you enjoy it, but more importantly, I hope you learn something new that will inspire you. Next, we will hear from Daniel Hernandez Alvarenga, who is a freshman and a Phelps Scholar, and will be reading one of Dr. Pablo Peschiera's original poems called In Search of the Oil Bird at Icononso.
Hello, my name is Daniel Andres Hernandez Alvarenga, Daniel Hernandez Alvarenga, without the flavor. Before I begin, I wanted to sort of give a little bit of insight into some of the terms used in the poem. The oil bird in the title, In the Search of the Oil Bird at Icononso, is the only nocturnal flying echolocating fruit-eating bird in the world. And there are also some lines included from Alexander von Humboldt, who was a great scientist in the 1800s. He was contracted by the King of Spain, Charles IV, to survey the scientific measurements of Central America for the purpose of determining economic opportunities. He was some of the first to describe scientifically and locally the impacts of development causing human-induced climate change, considered to be the father of ecology and environmentalism. I will now begin. In Search of the Oil Bird at Icononso, with lines ending from Alexander von Humboldt. At Icononso, the oil birds sleep. Here the valley walls reach down until they cup an invisible river, and two bridges, natural as blown seeds, span the gorge on tumbled knees, grown thick with pangola grass, to shade the birds on their ledges, with their feathers brown and gray in the depth. At Icononso, before the birds flow out at dusk to feed on the palm and hover, fat as hens, among the fruit trees. A man inclines above a dark too profound, and with companions drops a burning rocket down into the rushing murk. To his blue eyes, it seems, to float in the dank air and patiently strobe the crevice in a sweep of tar-smoked, guttering light. He sees the tender, fleshy hatchlings in the nests, and the black, reflective escudo, wide eyes beam, a startled, wakeful sight in the moment of the lantern's passing. As it falls down the twilit crevasse, the man thinks of bats and nighthawks. He thinks of Manolo, this moment's true beloved, left behind in Cumana, as fever squeezed the sweat out of that young body again. The birds rustle, slap the air with great wings and voices, to find, in the echoes, a new dusk's brilliant secrets. Years later, perhaps, he writes, in the middle of the second bridge of Icononso is a hollow of more than 8 meters square, through which the bottom of the abyss is perceived.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcy Santos, and I serve as the Culture and Inclusion Representative to Student Congress for the Latino Student Organization. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today for the Hispanic Heritage Month lecture, Dr. Pablo Peschiera. Dr. Pablo Peschiera was born in Toronto, Canada, to Peruvian parents. They returned to Peru for a time and then immigrated to the United States to settle in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He attended Hope College, graduating in 1993, and then he earned his Master's of Fine Arts and Master's at Western Michigan University, and his Ph.D. in Literature and Creative Writing at the University of Houston in 2005. Professor Peschiera returned to teach at Hope in 2008. He published over 100 reviews, translations, essays, and poems, and has received awards from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference and National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. For this lecture, Dr. Peschiera will talk about his life and gradual awakening as Latinx in the 20th and 21st centuries. Living as Hispanic, Latina, Latinx in the United States is defined by a related spectrum of complex and diverse histories and experiences. Professor Peschiera will talk about how he learned to access the complexities of diversities in the United States of the Latinx experience and how the lens of poetry helped him to feel more in touch with the world. And now, if you could all join me in giving Dr. Pablo Peschiera a warm welcome to the lectern.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Can you hear me okay? I'd like to thank the CDI, Jevin, Polly, Margot, Danielle, Camille, Marissa, Montse, everyone who's been organizing this event especially, and I'm really humbled to see so many people here. I thought it would be, the students I required to come or offered to give some extra credit to, and then my family. But really, so many more people came, and it's very heartening. We had one of my favorite artists playing before we got started here, Ima Sumac. She's known as the Peruvian songbird. She was born in Callao, Peru, which is the major port outside Lima, in 1922. She died in 2008. She was part of this exotica music trend in the 50s and 60s. Very beautiful, ethereal music. She sung in Quechua, she sung in Spanish, and she's one of my favorite artists. So if you have not heard her work, you should look it up. This is going to be titled How I Opened Myself Through Poetry. And the title is the 2024 Hispanic Heritage Month Lecture. I added on racial, ethnic, and cultural identity because that's what I wanted to focus on in this presentation, in this lecture, concerning my own racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. So here's a little bit of a content warning. I'm not sure we need it, but I think it's a good idea to mention it. This lecture is based on my life, experience, emotions, what I've learned, my thinking. I'm not a social scientist, so even though my numbers are sourced, don't cite them. Okay, don't cite them through me. Go to the source. If you need the source, I mention it 90% of the time. This is why I'm not a social scientist. 90% of the time, and then there are links I have, right? But the numbers are good. I suggest researching further. Racial, ethnic, and cultural identity are often emotionally fraught topics. Not everyone is on the same process of development in their ethnic identity or racial identity. And so I don't think anyone will need to leave, but if you would like to leave in order to take care of your emotions, please feel free to do so. So I'd like to talk about the inspiration for the poem In Search of the Oil Birds at Icononzo. I wrote that poem about a dozen years ago or so, got it published online. It's kind of an oldish poem for me. And I am proud of that poem. It references Alexander von Humboldt. Daniel read a very, very short bio about him. There are entire academic branches of universities in South America and Germany dedicated to the study of his work. If you'll notice, he's holding a cell phone. You didn't know he invented a cell phone, right? There's obviously an anachronistic painting of a portrait of him, but if he were alive today, he would be in that sphere. That's how advanced he was in around 1800. So he traveled for about 5 years through Latin America with the goal of mostly taking scientific recordings. That shows up pretty well. That's great. You're taking scientific recordings, talking to government ministers, understanding how can the country of Spain continue to extract wealth from Latin America. I mean, really, that's a political reason. He was going for his scientific reasons, right? He was very dedicated to science. Science was his passion. He was a brilliant individual who'd also inherited a lot of money, which is often how it worked out in the 18th and 19th centuries. If you were brilliant, you also needed a lot of money, right, which you didn't get through jobs. And so he did that, and he said that upon landing in South America, though it had not been proved that the fever was contagious, he thought it more prudent to disembark at Cumaná. And he spent a year in that part of the world. And if the fever had not broken out on board the Pizarro, interestingly named boat, Pizarro. Pizarro was, Francisco Pizarro was the guy who conquered Peru and did a lot of bad things while conquering Peru. But he would have never explored certain parts of that area. And during that exploration, that's when he went to see oil birds. That was the first time a Westerner had described oil birds in a written venue. And I want to focus on this a little bit. So Cumaná is there on the coast. Caracas is the capital of Venezuela. And he was going through an area that's jungle, primarily jungle. It gets into highlands further up along his trail as he travels south. You see that? So he was there for about a year, right? And this is what an oil bird looks like when it's nested on a rock. They are a rather large bird. It's very strange that the bird behaves the way it does. It doesn't seem like it should behave that way, so I wanted to play this video for you so you get a sense of what they look like, because they are extremely unusual birds. Now I'm worried I screwed up the presentation thing. Just look at this. This will be over soon. So they hover. They're not really supposed to do that for this kind of bird. They travel with echolocation. They really prefer the pitch dark. This is obviously taken with night vision. And there are some pictures towards the end here that I think are really interesting that capture their movement. And this one is kind of my favorite. You can see him. He's got the fruit of the oil palm in his mouth. And he's really been adapted to that single thing. The oil bird is actually very well distributed through parts of South America. Okay? And you can see towards the upper part of that picture where he would have traveled to find the oil bird. But there's more about von Humboldt that interested me. His personal life has been well speculated upon, but he seemed to have not had much of an actual personal life. He was, this is from an interview of a Humboldt scholar who has tried very hard to research his personal life through letters and writings about him that he did not write. So you can tell this person did an amazing amount of research. And there's this quote here. There is a telling anecdote about a certain Fräulein von R. who tried to attract Alexander von Humboldt's interest. So Alexander von Humboldt was a good-looking person. She wanted to engage him in conversation about measuring instruments. It's a great, great technique, right? In order to interest a man, ask them about what they are most passionate about. And then she inquired whether he had ever been in love, and he said, yes, but only with science. But even so, there's speculation that he was homosexual. And so I was thinking about what it would be like to travel for 5 years on a ship, which for anyone is a major commitment, right? Major commitment. And I was thinking about how he had a personal life. He was a friendly person. People enjoyed his company. He was witty. So if he were someone who was gay, and if he wanted to have a kind of romantic life on that trip, what would it have been like? And you can see that I referenced the fever and this imagined person, Manolo, who's kind of in the background of von Humboldt's life there. So what I was trying to do was think about this and think about this and go back and forth. Oil birds, von Humboldt. I thought at one point the poem would be about the oil birds more than von Humboldt, and then but would it be more about the trip? And really ended up being third person, thinking about how von Humboldt was, what he was thinking of when he was discovering these oil birds. He had many other kinds of scientific discoveries. But when you read his volumes, and I haven't read his volumes, when you read his volumes, you realize that there's very little good stuff to read in there. It's mostly charts and numbers and how many tons of wheat or corn, right? Or how much money they can make out of the beef industry. It's really dry, right? But the tidbits, like this tidbit, where he discovered the oil woods, is really, really interesting. So I really like those parts of his volumes. And this end of the poem uses some of the lines from his description of looking for the oil birds. And I found this very provocative, right? You know, the abyss got this great, like, we don't know what the abyss is. And I kind of felt like he was at this point in his life, he was about 31, 32. He was very well known, but still, he was very well known among his community as a scientist, but he hadn't really made his bones as like the super scientist that he was, and this was a big commitment for him to take. So I was really interested in that. And that's where the poem came from. So the poem was really about imagination and empathy. I think that when poets write, they are trying to write with a sense of imagination and empathy. I often write from a perspective where I'm trying to imagine how someone else would be experiencing their life, how they might experience me, or I'm trying to reach something that will allow me to have some insight into the way other people view the world. And this is connected to something I read in Percy Bysshe Shelley's Defense of Poetry, which was posthumously published and edited by a friend and Mary Shelley, his wife. Poetry defeats the curse which binds us to be subjected to the accident of surrounding impressions. Right? So the accident of surrounding impressions is basically what do we take in every day, what do we see through our five senses, and then do we simply accept it as face value, right? And I really like this essay. I read it often, usually about once every 3 or 4 months to see what else I can find in there. And this is one quote that came out to me recently. And then I literally saw this morning. So this is a quote from Shea McRae. Every poem was incomprehensible to me. And if I hadn't found poems incomprehensible and as a result read as many poems as I possibly could, I wouldn't have the life I have now. And I'm happy in my life. I'm better for the difficult poems I've struggled with. So Shea McRae is an incredibly talented, incredibly hardworking, producing poet. And he, in a lot of his poetry, he writes trying to understand how someone else made peace about some terrible things. He has this interesting poem you can find online on the Poetry Foundation website where he tried to understand how the President of the Confederate States of America could have a vision in which he was pro-slavery but had an adopted half-black son. I'm a big fan of this poem, right? So I think poetry gives us the opportunity to think about how people imagine the world differently, how someone was trying to square things that were not morally, they're really not morally acceptable in Shea McRae's case. And I'd like to talk about my racial, ethnic, and cultural identity because this is Hispanic Heritage Month lecture. And that's ultimately what this lecture is going to be about, right? How I have figured out what my racial, ethnic, and cultural identity are, and how poetry has helped me with understanding what that is and my journey, my continuing journey through my ethnic and cultural identity. So I want to talk about some terms briefly. American or Americano, right? Everyone in the Americas is American. My grandmother reminded me several times whenever I would say, los americanos son, she would say, pero nosotros todos son americanos. Yo soy de Peru, yo soy americano. And I'd say, yeah. Because, you know, estadounidenses, when you're younger, it's a little harder to say, so I didn't want to say it. Casually, some people in Spanish-speaking countries, they will say americano. They might say gringo, right? The correct term is estadounidenses. That's someone who is a citizen of the United States. But terms are always slippery anyway, right? Terms for Hispanics in the U.S. have shifted a lot over the decades. You all basically know this. I like to use Latine and Latinx because Latine contains non-gendered implications, and Latinx was originally used by LGBTQ plus groups in Mexico City about 20-some years ago, and it's non-binary. So I tend to use Latinx. A lot of people who write about issues of racial identity will use Latinx in the social sciences, but there isn't a rule. So you're not really using terms incorrectly. You're using Hispanic through all the Latinx, all the Latino Latinx versions, right? I know what I use and I know why I use it. I don't expect other people to use it. And there are also influences of colonization that people talk about. Several years ago, I heard the novelist Mario Vargas Llosa talking about how, you know, it's really the Latinos, or really people from Spanish-speaking countries, primarily. He was thinking of Central and Latin America and Mexico. And it doesn't, Latino shouldn't, he felt, include Spain, because Spain is a colonizing country. And many people from Latin America would like to set up a division there. But in the US, it's all part of the same pot, right? For complex reasons. So I also point out that the Philippines is a very large Asian country that is also considered Hispanic and Latino. Something like 60% of the words are Spanish in their main language, Tagalog. There's also a Creole, it's called Chabacano. It's spoken in some of the islands. It sounds almost exactly like Spanish. It's basically Spanish syntax. I want to break down some US census stuff. About 20% of the country right now is Hispanic or Latino, right? That's 1 in 5 people. And there's been a significant increase of people who are Latino. It breaks down this way if you're believing the US Census, right? So that we know. 18.9% of the total US population. It might be up to 20 at this point. The largest growing area is Latino. I think they've been recently surpassed by Asian American, but largest growing doesn't mean largest, right? And then let's look at how the ethnicity is growing. I think this is important in our current conversation. Right now, Hispanic births outpaced Hispanic deaths by almost 750,000, right? So that means Spanish are having a ton of babies, right? Immigration is only 1/3 of that population growth. So the story, what these numbers tell me, and I know there are social scientists here, so, you know, please don't shame me if I'm wrong, right? But what these numbers tell me is that the problem is not immigration. U.S. expects to be about 53% majority minority by 2050, right? So it's important that we have discussions about ethnicity and race and cultural identity. I'd like to talk about my ethnicity, the way I understand my ethnicity. And I understand it as Latine, Latinx, and Peruvian American, right? My parents' identities are Italian Peruvian. or Italo-Peruvian. I'm going to talk about that too. Peru has a very large Italian population, but that is a minority of Peruvian population. A race is a categorization of humans based on shared physical and sometimes social qualities that's divided into groups generally viewed as distinct within a given society, right? So the ideas in different cultures have different ways of expressing themselves. Ethnicity and race are expressed very differently between the United States and Canada as compared to the rest of South America. So I'd like to talk about the casta system in South America. And I also know many of you have touched upon this. But I'm thinking about this as like for students who haven't thought about this, because many people who enter college never think about the casta system. They may have heard about it, but it is a central system that has shaped the way Latinos look at themselves in terms of race and class. So this is a picture from 18th century Mexico, several pictures, that gave certain pairings of people from different classes a particular outcome, right? So the Spanish colonies and Spain outlawed slavery much earlier than the English-speaking colonies, okay, or former colonies, much, much earlier. It happened in a different way. What was very important historically was that the Catholic Church argued very strongly against slavery. The royalty of Spain were very devout Catholics. They followed that advice, and therefore, slavery existed among, say, slaves bought in Africa for a while, but then that died out. But very quickly, indigenous Latin Americans were not enslaved, and they were immediately enslaved by the conquistadores, right? So that ended in like the late 16th century, the legalized slavery. That doesn't mean they were enslaved. They were enslaved in different ways, right? Through encomendia systems, which is kind of like a serfdom. People were stuck where they were. They couldn't travel, things like that. But they were trying to use some of the systems that existed before with the Inca Empire in Peru and other indigenous empires and groups. And because of this, because it was not legal to own a slave, then they couldn't make the argument that you cannot marry, because everyone was becoming Christian. So because everyone's Christian, everyone can marry a Christian. So the white Spaniards needed a way to maintain their higher status. So they came up with the casta system. And it meant that when you married someone who was not part of your quote-unquote race, your progeny would have a different designation. And if you manage it the right way, for your progeny, maybe they could become white again. Their children could become white, right? So if you look at the upper left, it's hard to see. It says Español con India is mestizo, right? They would even divide this among genders. So mestizo is a boy. Mestizo con española is castizo, right? So you can see that's getting a little more white. So they did not practice endogamy, right? The U.S. practiced endogamy. White people and black people could not marry. People of Asian people and white people could not marry. Asian and black people marrying was discouraged. Endogamy is the way that the U.S. created their divisions along race. Latin America created their class system that was defined by race, but your race did not determine your class system too exclusively. There are several examples of this. Here you can see this upper one gets to lighter colors, more European on the top row, and in the bottom row gets to more indigenous and African colors. That makes sense to everyone? Okay, so a lot of racism. Some of my family likes to say there isn't really racism in Peru, and it's true that there are no longer legal designations, but there is racism in Peru, right? let's look at this genre of painting. There was an entire genre of family portrait painting where you could get a painting done with your family. These were people who had some means. It was very expensive to have your portrait made in oil. And then you could explain to anyone who wanted to visit you in your house what you were, right? So in the upper left, it's de español y albina torna atrás, right? So that's a particular designation. Albina is white person, torna atrás. And then, so albina meant white but not Spanish. Then on the right, de español y castiza, español. So if a Spanish person could find a castiza woman to marry, their son and daughter could be Spanish. So you see what's going on here? There was a drive towards whitening. And then this is an interesting one. De mestizo y India produce coyote. Right? So there were many designations. Different countries or areas had different designations for these race mixing classifications. And here is a recent Latin America race map. Once again, I don't know if it's socially accurate according to numbers, but it makes sense based on the way I understand Latin America. You can see predominantly Europed here. The name is gone at the bottom. That's Argentina. That's mostly light green. You see that lime green? Argentina is overwhelmingly white in percentage. Everyone from Latin America knows this, right? And the reason that area is overwhelmingly white is because Argentina in the 20th century said, hey, those Americans, those estadounidenses, they have a great idea. They had their civil war and that was rough, but then they took that military machine and they went west and they pushed all the Native Americans out west to the bad land and they killed a bunch of them. We should do that too. So that's what Argentina did. Populations, however, were very different across Latin America and Central America. The densest number of indigenous people after the conquest was definitely in the Andes, north, and in southern and central Mexico. So we're talking about the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire. And that tends to be like the densest amount of mestizo and Native American parts. Bolivia is definitely overwhelmingly Native American in ethnic makeup. But even so, there's lots of mixture. The word mestizo just means mixture. There's lots of mixture throughout Latin America. It is very much a racially mixed, culturally mixed part of the world, as America was kind of designed to be. And this gets at what you've noticed through the casta system is colorism, right? So there is the issue of race and color becomes really important. Colorism sticks around with us today. About half of Hispanics hear racially insensitive jokes about other Hispanics. This is a recent survey from the Pew Center. The survey happened in about 2001, 2002. And half to a little more than half, even if you have lighter skin, you hear racially insensitive jokes between Hispanics, right? And it can be little things, right, that many people who come from a Hispanic family are familiar with. So one way that Hispanics tend to have talked about race was that it is part of their family, but there's still this colorism sense that has existed. And I want to talk about two things that we notice about U.S. Latinos that are very particular and consistent, because Latinos come from so many different backgrounds, so many different places, so many different cultural sets, that it's hard to find durable commonality. But two things are very, very durable. One is familyism, where families have a set of normative beliefs where they are going to help the family. What they do is to help the family. They educate themselves, they work, bless you, because they want to help the family support each other. And that includes, generally speaking, among Latinos, that includes extended families, cousins, aunts, grandparents, things like that, right? So Latinx adolescents report that reason, but white adolescents report that their work education paths are really about individuality and getting out of their parents' household and not being a burden on their parents anymore, or having their self-determination, right? And language is also a strong marker, right? Language among Latinos becomes probably the biggest marker that we notice. The Pew Research Center poll said that 95% of all Latinx feel retaining Spanish is important to identity, but that changes a little bit. 71% of adult Hispanics feel it's important. I tend to feel it's important, but I don't think it's the only thing that matters. I think there's much more that matters when it comes to defining yourself as Latino. But I understand the tendency, right? That being said, 3/4 of Latinx speak Spanish at home. Who speaks Spanish best here? Who speaks Spanish best here? Samuel, raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, you're wrong. But thank you for coming. Yeah. No, one of them speaks Spanish much better than the other, but thank you. Who speaks Spanish best? Anyone? Yes.
She was the one that played Queen's Gambit.
Okay, that's right. Anna Taylor-Joy. She is British and Argentinian. So she spent her early formative years in Argentina, then went to Great Britain, and so she speaks English with a British accent, and then she went back to Argentina, and then she came to the U.S. She was actually accidentally born in the U.S. because her parents were in Miami at the time. But her parents are British Argentinian, right? So she thinks of herself as Argentinian. Her hair is brown, though, and Jenna Ortega is Mexican Puerto Rican. She's from Southern California, and Rachel Zegler, her mother is Colombian. But neither one of them feel comfortable beginning greetings or discussion in Spanish. They understand Spanish well, but Ana sounds like she's from Argentina, right? So being Latinx is not your race. I would like to talk about Peruvian origin population as well. It kind of makes it seem the Peruvians are exploding, and exploding would not be accurate, although it looks like it. I mean, in 2000, Peruvian Americans, U.S.-born or foreign-born, was about 250,000. Now it's almost 750,000 in 20 years. That seems very fast to me, right? And I'm not sure exactly. Well, no, that's not true. There's been a lot of political strife in Peru. At one point, we had 4 presidents in 2 years. It was a fascinating time. Stressful time, very difficult time. So Peru has been going through some things. Nonetheless, the vast majority of my family is still in Peru. And ethnicity in Peru is different depending on how you slice it or determine it. This is one data source from the government of Peru that organizes the numbers like this. I'm going to look primarily at East Asian and white, because when you get to this source, which is the CIA World Fact Book, white people are 15% as opposed to almost 6%, and 0.6% East Asian as opposed to 3% Asian. Maybe they're using slightly different terms. I'm not sure who's reporting it. But you can tell that the vast majority of Peru is indigenous and mixed, right? Something like 75 to 80%. So in that context, right, what does that mean for me? Right? I'm definitely Latinx, right? Beverly Tatum talks a lot about. I'm going to refer to Beverly Tatum a lot because I'm teaching her this semester. But she talks about how race in the United States context is as much determined by how people view you as opposed to how your family talks about race. Okay? How people view you ends up being the most durable experience you have in terms of race, right? And so for me, that's Latinx. I've lived in the United States for 50 years now. We moved here when I was 5. And Italian Peruvian, if I'm in Peru, I mean, we'll talk about that a little bit later. This is my father. This is not a great picture, but I love this picture. It's my father and two of his sisters, Antonio, his sister Rosario and Sandra, and Mami Yoli. Mami Yoli, lovely woman, kind of like the kind of grandmother you want, very sweet to her grandchildren. My dad says he was a little hard on her, but I feel like, he was also really lucky to have his mother, because I thought she was very, very nice. He loved his mother very much. She lived to be 97. Lived with my father. My father moved back to Peru after he retired. He was a medical doctor. So Yolanda, she was adopted. We know she was adopted within the family, but there are elements of that I think are still unclear. Like, how did the adoption happen? She had a few sisters. So that part of the family is not as clear to me or my father as other parts of the family. This is my mother. My mother's in the upper left. Her name is Aida. Her two sisters, and Meme, Alicia Alfaro Roca. Very fair-skinned, this side of the family, right? Really lovely people. This grandmother was not the nice grandmother. She was nice to me. I loved her. She was nice to me. But she was not the one I went to when I needed cuddles, right? But this was my mother's mother. And this was my mother. Everyone on my mother's side of the family had beautiful, bright blue eyes, right? Which, in Peru is unusual, right? But my family is Italian primarily in their background. Here is my mother and my father at some kind of formal dance. My mother was just getting out of high school at that time. My father was starting medical school. So it was kind of like an ideal match given their social relationships, right? My grandfathers were close to each other. Everyone knew each other. It made a lot of sense. And they ended up having me, right? And that's one of my little cousins in back who's trying to sneak into the picture, I think. But I love this picture. We all look so young. We're also wearing a poncho, typical Peruvian ponchos, right? So I like that about this picture as well. This is me. In Canada, I love this picture. I think I'm cute as the Dickens in my little tiger bib. Yes, and this is Andreita, my little sister, and me. I was trying to push her cart at the time, still in Canada, before we moved back to Peru. Andrea actually went to Hope College the year after me, and she graduated from Hope as well. But she was a smart one. She was Phi Beta Kappa. And so she caught up with me, basically. She's 1 year younger than I am. 1 year and 2 weeks younger than I am. This is us in the mountains, in the Andes, in Peru. We have a lot of pictures like that. I tended to be kind of a smart aleck, so I was always making silly faces and doing silly things in pictures. But I love this picture. This is Gabrielita, our youngest sister, 12, 11 years younger than us. She went to K College. So, that's not a disappointment. K is higher ranked than Hope, right? But she went to K College. And this is us in front of the house we lived in at the time in Portage, outside Kalamazoo. So we're really Michiganders, right? Gabriela was the first person who was born in the United States. I'd like to talk about Hope statistics, so my student years at Hope and the way things are different now. And I don't have a judgment on this. I do have certain preferences. The world is going certain ways. 1991 Anchor article, right? Statistics were 3% in 76, 3.74% in 1989, and 95.26% roughly of majority white at Hope in 1990. Even at the time, it was a very, very low number of students of color. Now, white is about 82%. I think this is from these numbers are from 2002 or 2020. I think it's more like white is 20% at the moment. But Hope is gradually, and I think intelligently, patiently trying to increase the diversity enrollment among undergraduates. Hope is far behind comparable schools, right? And why does that matter? That matters actually in ways we do not think about. One is that it does matter in ranking. Ranking is affected by diversity of the student population. Ranking is affected by the diversity of the staff and the faculty at all levels these days, more than it was, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I'd also like to talk about survival in college. So my racial and ethnic identity was more based on sports, dudes, poetry, and literature. I wasn't I didn't lean into my Latinx identity. I like sports. Also, if you wanted to have quote unquote fun at the time in 1990, you joined a sporting team and a fraternity. And everyone here on the lacrosse team that I played with was also in my fraternity. So I spent time worrying about that. I also spent time worrying about my stuttering. I still had a terrible stutter through college. So that took up a lot of my emotional energy. And really what helped me began to help me unlock my racial identity awareness or ethnic identity awareness in a way that wasn't strictly linked with just being Peruvian or being, quite honestly, my father being a physician, being middle class, right, was the Jack Riddle Visiting Writer Series. And it was the variety of writers that came to the Jack Riddle Visiting Writer Series. So when I was a student, the poet and novelist Al Young, one of the most famous blues poets of all blues poets, big effect. Lee Young Lee, one of the most interesting poets of the 1990s, of our time, Asian, American, Chinese American, was actually born, I can't remember if he was born in China or Vietnam. His parents fled during the Cultural Revolution. Fascinating person. I loved his work. I still love his work. Gerald Stern, Jewish writer, very famous. Very well published, very charming writer. And so I was being exposed to people who were very different from me at the time through the Jack Riddle Visiting Writers Series. Joy Harjo also came. I have some stories, great stories. Make me look silly. She was great. She's a very good performer, a very good reader. She's come twice to Hope. And Charles Simic, who's actually a Serbo-American poet, kind of surrealist, and he was a really interesting person. I really loved his stuff. So one of the things that really opened me up to the world, just by being a student, that I could do for free was just go to this reading series. At the time, it was among the most diverse things going on, and it's still among the most diverse series of events going on campus. It's run by my colleague, Susanna Childress right now. I'd like to talk about my earliest Latinx poet. So as I was in college and after college, right around that time when you're getting out of college, I went to grad school, right? I went to grad school because I loved poetry and reading, and that's kind of all I wanted to do, but I was afraid to enter the real world because I stuttered, and it was scary. I did not want to be judged for my stuttering, right? And so I went into grad school, and I succeeded in grad school, and I worked on my stuttering very, very hard that first year of grad school, and I learned how to manage it. So I hope my stuttering's been pretty good today. What people say about stuttering is that you're always a stutterer. There are times other people don't notice. So my earliest Latinx poets were people like Martin Espada. I love this poem, Puerto Rican Autopsy. Winter corpsed in East Harlem, opened his head and found a rainforest. So when I first read this poem, I realized that there were, and I am talking about this particular poem, I realized that there were major events going on, major things going on among Latinx people who were interested in poetry that I hadn't accessed, and that they were thinking about the world in ways that were both related to the way I thought about the world, but also very different, right? And this is one of them. I'm a big fan of Martin Espada. He's a very proactive workers' rights, union rights. He kind of makes his living, has made his living as a photographer, but also as a poet more lately. Brilliant. Then there's also Judith Ortiz Cofer, who I became a big fan of. Her writing started taking started getting more published in like the early 90s, late 80s, and I like this poem and poems like it, Women Who Love Angels. They are thin and rarely merry, living out their long lives in spacious rooms, French doors giving view to formal gardens where aromatic flowers grow in profusion. They play their pianos in the late afternoon, tilting their heads at a gracious angle, as if listening to notes pitched above the human range. Age makes them translucent, each palpitation of their hearts visible at temple or neck. When they die, it's in their sleep, their spirits shaking gently loose from a hostess too well bred to protest. So when I first read this poem, I was thinking of some of the middle-aged women in my family who were uncoupled and who were part of the family yet somehow isolated from the social fabric of their community. Mostly older women, like my parents' generation or older. And since then, I've found many examples of Latino people writing about this kind of segment of society, right? So women who did not enter the convent, but who had this kind of both frustrated personal life that was frustrated by the limits of society placed on them. And this is very much a Latinx story, a Catholic Latinx story for women, right? And there are other poets I'm not going to spend too much time on. Rodolfo Corque González, Yo soy Joaquín, perdido en un mundo de confusión. I am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion. Very angry poem. This is a revolution poem from the 60s. And it's through this poem that I began to research the La Raza movement among Mexican Americans, right? Fascinating poem. Long poem. Alurista, Mexican poet. Here's an example of a poetry on the beach. This was the poet that really first opened up the possibility of multilingual poetry to me, which wasn't something I thought too seriously about. On the beach. On the beach chair, he thinking across the peaks, slushing, joshing, but not really. The snow be as much his as a sun mine. Borg, I said, and he thought Jorge Luis, of course, the hummingbird sucks on, and the willow weeps, and Dylan is Bob, even though Thomas was and is a good poet. He lived off his agenda, while Tomas has his Hawkeye on the line, the borderline. Yes, the grand little man, el comandante, poeta de la sierra, sandina tierra, I listen hablando, se entiende la gente. True. Kind of an experimental stream of consciousness poet. Blew me away. I did not like it. When I first read it, I did not like it, right? As Shea McCrae said, it's the difficult poems that led me to something better as I continued to read. And Cesar Vallejo, the poet, the great poet of Peru, probably the most celebrated poet of Peru, fascinating person. He was mestizo, he grew up very poor, he educated himself. He wrote his first book, Los Heraldos Negros, and it was a tremendous success in the literary world. But because of his background, he was also very much worried about the poor people of Peru, which is still has struggles with poverty, mostly among Native Americans and mestizo people, almost exclusively among Native Americans and mestizo people. So there is a real racial divide in terms of class in Peru. And I like this poem quite a bit. Hay golpes en la vida tan fuertes, yo no sé, golpes como del odio de Dios, como si antes ellos la resaca de todo lo sufrido se emporzaba en el alma, yo no sé. Son pocos pero son, abren zanjas oscuras en el rostro más fiero y en el lomo más fuerte. It's a very powerful poem. And I'm talking about all these poems and about all of this to get to my poem, The Chestnut Tree. It's a more recent poem. So I'm going to read through this, and then mercifully we're going to be done. Right? This is a long poem, okay? But it's in English. Okay. My name, if I were from Italy, my name would be Paolo, I'm sure, and I would wear linen suits tailored by an erect and stout man who knew my grandmother and who, I imagine, did not mind measuring my inseam or touching my body, men's bodies, with his quick and confident hands, the hands he would have crossed himself with when he genuflected as he took the pew in Santa Lucia's, the church that sits just at the piazza in the village, almost hidden by the chestnut tree planted by the old men, after the previous one was blown apart and cinder burned to never recover as the Germans retreated north from the Lago di Garda near the end of World War II. In the spring, the old chestnut would burst into pinnate leaves like a fountain of green, maustoso, the tailor would say, and every fall, the villagers would gather with sheets stretched open between them, and the men would hold aloft long poles and smack the branches to coax the chestnuts to falling into the sheets held on a slant. And, funneled, they'd tumble into baskets tall as a child and wide as a goat is long. My grandmother, as would have been her habit, kept one chestnut still in its spiny husk from the old tree in a dresser drawer during the war, and when she unfolded her handkerchief on an afternoon when the trees and the mountains around and above the piazza and Santa Lucia's and the village began again to fill in their branches, the spiny husk split, and the nut, burnished in brown, fell out onto the cobblestones. The old men would have exclaimed, "Bravo!" and "Eviva!" and "Salute!" their hands in the air, smiles on their cracked faces. It seemed that no one had smiled in years. After clearing the debris, and once the few young men still alive returned to the village, the nut, planted and nursed for years outside the low wooden back door of Santa Lucia, the door the priest stole through after evening mass, would have grown out of its nursing pot to replace the old tree in the piazza. On the hills surrounding the village they could have planted, but my grandmother, beautiful, young and charming, cajoled them. This is the story the tailor would have told, as he would have heard it from his father, who would have been there when the chestnut fell from the handkerchief from my grandmother, who would have unfolded in the piazza, and how I'd imagine a sliver of my life's memories if I had been Italian. That I would wear tailored suits made of linen, and the man who cut them intimately knew who I was. And I imagine this because Peschiera, my family name, sounds gorgeous to me. Banks of long grasses, a bright jewel of a mountain lake, river-fed, where the fish are harvested from a pool, fed by water, singing ripples as it tumbles down granite stairs. And translated into English, Peschiera means fish pond. And in my mind, I changed the translation to pond for fish. Or even better, pool for fish, so I can love the translation, so I can think of it as my own. 6,000 miles away, through a video call from Peru, my father, Antonio, insists his children are at least 80% Italian. And being the kind of son I am, I want to refute his claim because I know it's wrong. But his imagination is old, and I worry, too brittle to dodge the insult he'd feel, so long has he, like many in our family, held on to that legacy. Peschiera appears in a book about Italian immigrants to Peru and on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, in a long list of cities conquered by Napoleon, and in Canto 20 of Dante's Inferno in reference to a witch that could be found near the river delta of the Munso Fume, through which all the waters of the Lago di Garda flow. We know my grandfather's grandfather traveled the world looking for his America. He found it in Chincha, near the mouths of the Rio Chico and the Rio Mata Gente on the desert coast of Ica in Peru, between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn. It almost never rains in Chincha. Paolo, my great-great-grandfather, moved his family to that desert over 100 years ago in the last big migration from Italy to South America. And so my Peruvian family's identity in the lands of the Nazca, in the driest desert in the world. Antonio, such an Italian name, learned English when he moved to the US and years later took classes in Italian, but it never really stuck. He always used the Spanish he learned growing up in Peru. Antonio sends messages every day to a chain of family and friends, some who I've never met but once, and some who I've yearned to hold again, though I don't know if I ever will. His messages read like notes in a bottle from a place I've almost forgotten, where old women pinch the cheeks of grandchildren, where cousins dance to tunes before reggaeton. Nightly, my father puts himself to bed on our mythic Italianness. 23andMe cuts me into slices. 38% Italian, yes, nearly the same piece of Southern European, a thick portion of African, which we knew from family history, and a sliver of Native American. Mezclado, diminuto, mestiza, pardo, some might have said, though never in front of me. One summer I mentioned this to my father, that my sisters and I all have some piece of Native American, and that we think it comes through his mother's side, the one who treated us most gently. Her skin was as smooth as a velvet glove. She was adopted, and we could only guess, and my father, mouth open, looked stunned. That's a mistake, he said, and his face couldn't take it in at the moment, as if our stories about ancestors didn't encompass the Peruvian, speakers of Quechua, and Aymara, descendants of the Inca Empire, the greatest American civilization before Columbus, they say. As though we could choose the blood that boiled inside of us. I am not Italian or really Peruvian, if you ask a Peruvian, and in the US, I've often been told that I'm not American either. So today, sometimes, I dreamed that someone in my family harvested a chestnut tree that could have given shade during the warm summers of Lombardy, just over there in the piazza, the church hidden almost by the canopy of the chestnut the village fathers planted at the end of World War II. Not long after the previous chestnut blown apart, as the Germans retreated from the Lago di Garda and never recovered. It was majestic, the tailor would have said maestoso, like a great fountain of green every spring, and every late fall the villagers would have gathered with sheets stretched open between them. The men holding aloft long poles, smacking the branches to coax the chestnuts into falling on the sheets, held on a slant and funneled, the nuts tumbling into baskets. They would be made into flour, from which would come gnocchi, slick in brown butter, and gnocchi, the wafer-thin cakes almost singed around the edges, and the chocolate fillings of our Christmas cookies would cloy us with the taste of chestnuts. When visiting our families and friends on Christmas evening, we would have walked between our homes. We would have warmed our hands with the chestnuts we'd roasted in the hearth fires. My name, if I were Italian, my name would be Paolo, and no one would wonder if I belonged to that land, those hills, that village and piazza, that chestnut tree. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Monty, and I am a senior here at Hope College studying social work and psychology. I have the pleasure and honor of serving as LSO's president this year. I want to thank you all for coming out to listen to Dr. Pablo Peschiera speak this afternoon. We are all so honored at this amazing opportunity to hear from such an incredible and knowledgeable person. So we will now move on forward to the Q&A portion. If you have any questions, please scan the QR code that is located on the screen to submit your questions. We also have note cards if you prefer to write them down, and we will submit them for you. If you would like one, please raise your hand, and our volunteers will come to you with a pen and a note card. Polly's in the back if you would need that. Okay, so we're gonna start. So the first question that we have for you is, how did your poetry at Hope College help you to express your identity?
At the time, I thought it was an amazing opportunity to get into a group of people who were willing to listen to me talk about what I felt. There were therapeutic values there. And this was in creative writing classes, right? I wrote before I came to college, and I was very anxious about it. I knew my family wasn't especially interested in me being a writer. They thought, well, that's a nice hobby, right? How will you make a living? And that's great advice if you are in Latin America. It's not bad advice in the US sometimes, right? But especially in Latin America. Writers who try to make their living through writing have a very hard time in Latin America. So for my parents, it was a really bad idea. So it was wonderful to be able to share my poetry in a group. And I had very welcoming professors. Jack Riddle was very welcoming. Nancy Nicodemus was very welcoming. I felt very, very much supported by my professors. Yeah.
Okay, what advice would you give students who are trying to find and feel empowered in their self-identity?
I think that, well, you asked in their self-identity, Monse, right? And so I think you need to focus on whatever is salient, right? So salient meaning most important, right? And for some people, it means it is their racial or ethnic group. And I think when you go to a predominantly white institution, that can be extremely supportive. I think we've all noticed as well that there are people of color on campus who don't spend time with an MSO, right? And that's often because their identity is more wrapped up with other things. For me, it was sports, and being part of a fraternity was a way to be with people who had fun, right? And that was interesting to me. So I kind of felt like I found my communities. There was no one of those groups that were Latino. I had some friends and acquaintances who were Latino, but there were so few, right, that they were never in the space I was in at the same time, right? I think it's very different now, right? But I think that the thing is, what we've been learning through this Beverly Daniel Tatum book we're teaching this semester, several of you know it really well, is that one's racial identity is developed through contact with the racial group that your society puts you with, right? So at some point, you need to grapple with that, right? People of color, people who are in the subordinate group, a subordinate group, often are reminded that they are in that subordinate group, even if they are not spending a lot of time with people in that subordinate group, right? So it can be certain things like jokes, right? Unintended microaggressions, intended microaggressions can remind you of who you are. And then people of color are often forced to grapple with that designation. So even if you go into an identity group that seems more important or salient for you, at some point you have to come to peace with how people perceive you, right? That's a short way of saying it. For the dominant identity group has the advantage in the United States. White is the dominant identity group, so people of European background, often they can step out, right? That's kind of like the advantage in a way. So people can genuinely care about equity, can consider themselves allies, but if they step out, that's not an option for people of color, right? I've heard things say like on campus, like, what's wonderful about America is that you can always really change who you are. And I think that's true of the American goal, right? That's what America and all the Americas are really about. The United States in particular economically. But for people who are always reminded about their identity, it becomes more difficult.
So drawing from that, I think intersectionality is a huge part of this. What advice would you give to people who have intersectional identities that are, multiple of them are oppressed or are constantly being reminded of these identities that they have?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, there are many people in the world who are African American and LGBTQ+, women who are Latinx, and I think it's finding a group that will support the identity that needs supporting, right? We all know that there are only so many hours in the day, right? I mean, I've got something late right now that was due on the 15th. Many of you know what that is, right? If you're faculty, right? So I got the email yesterday. I have to send a form to, not a form, but a letter to the provost, right? Because I was working on this. last week. But why did I say that, Monse?
Intersectionality.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Violet. That's my daughter. She understands my thoughts better than I do. That's Violet. Yeah. So every day we only have so many hours. We need sleep. We need to eat, right? And so I think it's about caring for the identity that most needs caring for. And so there are often seasons and opportunities, right? So sometimes there are more opportunities to care for, say, one aspect of your identity, and other times there are more opportunities to care for another. And it's very common, I think, for people when they leave college, they can pay attention to a particular identity that maybe was neglected during college. For me, that was my racial, ethnic, and cultural background, right? I didn't neglect it. Like I kind of knew who I was, but I didn't know the context in which that identity existed, right? And so I could pay much better attention to that once I got to graduate school and as part of like my reading. I was one of those, okay, I'm just gonna out myself, and a couple people really know this in the room because they were my former professors. I was not a good student, right? And the reason I was a good student, I was not a good student, is that I would read all the time, and I would skim what was assigned, right? So I was reading all kinds of contemporary literature. So when I talk about Martín Espada and Judith Ortiz Gopher, I got so excited about them, I just started reading all that stuff. I was reading the best American poetry, the best American fiction, the best American nonfiction. I would read the whole thing. There's an anthology that comes out every year. I'd read all that stuff because I was so amazed by what was available out there and the different kind of people out there. And so, to be honest, I really loved the classes I was in, but at a certain point, I decided that this contemporary stuff was more important for me emotionally to read. And then, once I got to grad school, that's kind of why I got my M.A. in literature, because I felt like I didn't give enough attention to the traditions of literature. Yeah. And I say this because that was what was feeding me at the time. And it was really feeding me emotionally in ways I didn't understand, right? I didn't know why that mattered so much to me. But it mattered because I was reading from such a wide variety of people, wide diversity of people. That was something I didn't really have exposure to in most of the spaces I was in. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you took creative writing classes, and that's how you really got into poetry. Mm-hmm. What made you gravitate towards poetry specifically over other genres?
So I think I have two answers, Monty. So one is that I was really fascinated with how words work and interact. You could say at the molecular level, right? So when you put 2 or 3 words together and rearrange them and put in a different word, I was really interested how that changed the way the words were understood, even though the denotative meaning could be the same, the connotative meaning could really change. That fascinated me, and it always had. I also think that my parents would bring up poems they thought were fascinating that I didn't understand. So I was curious about it, and I would read them and reread them until I thought I understood them when I was younger. And this is something I haven't thought about until recently, but I'm just being totally honest. I'm a bad typist. I was a bad typist. I was a worse typist in college. My dad said, you're never going to need to type. And so he wouldn't let me take the typing class. I don't know. I just did what my dad said, right? And we've talked about it since then. He kind of regrets that decision. But I could have worked on it harder. I could have worked on it on my own. I know that. Yeah, I was into football and lacrosse and stuff like that. But I liked the pace of writing poetry. Yeah. It's slower. And I liked the pace of writing poetry. Yeah. And I think that not being a great typist had something to do with that. Yeah.
You kind of touched on this already, but when was the first time that you realized that writing was an important way to express yourself and to reflect on your identities?
I think in high school, I showed a poem to a friend of mine. And he was not in my friend group. He was more in the arts band friend group, and I was in like the sporty friend group. but he was a nice guy, and I showed him. He was like really supportive, and I don't know if he said anything like. I don't know if he had any. He didn't have advice for me. He was very supportive. He wrote songs, so I thought maybe he'll understand what I'm doing here. I'm not going to show it to these people; they'll just tease me, right? So I showed it to Joe Gross, was his name, and he ended up getting an M.F.A. in nonfiction, eventually, yeah. And he took a lot of poetry classes as an undergrad at Loyola University in Chicago. So that was the first time I ever felt like my work was worth showing to people. And then once I got into classes, and I can remember this very clearly, Jack Riddle said to me, because I didn't talk, right? I stuttered. I didn't really talk, especially when I wasn't around people I knew, when I was around strangers. And one time during a break in an evening class, Jack said, "You've been doing this for a while, haven't you?" And I was really surprised, right, that he figured that out, because I didn't tell him, right? And I was like, yeah, how do you know that? Are you a, are you a mind reader? It was that kind of thing. And so I started getting good feedback about it, and then I thought it would be, that it wasn't not worth doing. Yeah.
So you've kind of explained how you learned to open yourself through poetry and explore your racial and ethnic identity. Have you used poetry to open yourself in other aspects of your life? Like, for example, becoming a parent and religion, others?
Yeah, I mean, I've written a lot about my daughter. And it's usually when I have a few poems about when she was falling asleep that I really like. I've written a lot about my relationship to my family as a son. I've written, but also, I mean, to be honest, sometimes the things I write about are really weird. I have, like, the title, The Chestnut, kind of became clear by accident. I was just trying to write about the chestnut tree, and I kind of used a prompt from this poet I admire. And I have this series of poems I published many years ago where the title is all trees, and they're surreal and weird, where basically I got this idea where, what if the speaker in the poem is the tree? It sounds like such a hippie thing to do, right? It's so weird. And I really like the poems, but I would be shy to show them to someone who doesn't read poetry. It would seem pretty opaque. So, and also I've really gotten into like the oil birds at Icononzo. I really enjoy writing about people I don't know who I would like to understand better. In fact, like I know several people around here have done that really well, like Greg Rappley back there. You may not know him. He's written these amazing poems about how he imagines his Irish identity that I think are terrific, right? So I this is something poets do a lot, and that's what I most often do.
So you talk a lot about how poetry helped you understand parts of your identity. Do you believe that poetry is now a necessary part of your identity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't identify myself as a poet, because to me, identity is something that is to me, it's kind of immutable, right? It's something that you cannot actively change. Yeah. I can stop writing poems, right, which I have for long periods of time, and I don't feel like a poet if I'm not writing and reading poems. When I'm reading poems, I feel like a reader of poems. Mm-hmm. But often when you read poems, you get to writing poems pretty quickly. So I don't think of my identity as a poet. I think of it as a kind of vocation. Yeah, but my identity is really wrapped up in my family history, and yeah.
Okay, so unfortunately we're running out of time, so this will be our last question. What is the most impactful work you were a part of during your time at Hope College?
The most impactful work? I don't know. Impactful to me or impactful to other people?
Whichever you prefer. Both.
I think impactful to me was probably some of the volunteer work I did for the Jack Riddle Visiting Writer Series. I mentioned the poet Joy Harjo, and she still is a very, very big deal in the literary world, right? And I drove her home I drove her to the airport, and she was very nice. I carried her bag. I was coaching lacrosse in Grand Rapids at the time, so I had lacrosse sticks in the car, and she sat in the car and we were chatting, and I just got really nervous, and I just started talking a lot, and we talked about lacrosse, and I talked about identity because I thought she could really hear me, and she was very nice. She was very nice, listened to me, and said, "Yeah, this is like part of the journey you go through," and I'm sure she's like, "Boy, I can't wait to get out of this car," right? But she was very nice, and we talked about lacrosse, and she's like, my people play stickball. She's Cherokee, and she's Cherokee in another tribe. She grew up in Oklahoma, and she's like, yeah, they play stickball, and they use a different kind of stick and things like that. So, and I was really into the fact that lacrosse is a Native American sport originally, right? And in fact, lacrosse players tend to be that way anyway. And so that was really impactful for me, was my work with not my work with, but when I got to be around these writers I really admired. I got really nervous, and I kept riding up on people in front of me, and she would say, "Watch yourself." She was really nice about it. She would say, "Watch yourself," and that was very gentle as well, because I've driven, not while I was in college, but in grad school, I've driven writers who were very angry, right, if I made a mistake driving. She was really nice, and yeah, she was very nice. So that was probably the most impactful for me. Probably the most impactful stuff I did, I felt, was being part of the lacrosse team. I ended up being captain of the team, and I don't think that helped the team that much, but that was impactful for I learned that I was capable of organizing things, let's put it that way. So I could organize things and help people kind of realize goals. That was the first time I ever did something like that. Yeah.
Once again, I, as well as LSO as a whole, would like to thank Dr. Pablo Peschiera for coming out and speaking with us today. I hope you're all able to take this talk with you and let it influence the way you go about creating change. We appreciate your commitment to advocacy and bringing about radical change.